Good to see each of you here this evening. We know that each of us only have a certain amount of time in our lives, a certain number of days. We don't know how many that is, but we do know that it's not a good thing to waste our time. Any successful business knows the importance of time. Anybody involved in farming or agriculture knows the importance of time. So we don't want to waste that. But it's interesting to think about that in relation to our prayers, because we can, in fact, waste our time in prayer if we are praying a certain way. Many people don't often think of prayer in terms of acceptable or unacceptable. They usually just think, well, if you're praying, that's a good thing. And often it is, but not necessarily. We can pray unacceptable prayers. We can do things that aren't right in God's sight like that. So we're going to talk about that tonight, and thinking about that question on the screen: is your prayer a waste of time? I don't know of anybody that would like to say yes to that, and yet we're going to see some situations, some scenarios tonight where that is the case. And so we don't want to pray in a wrong sort of way. We want to be right in our thinking and in our motivations, because the last thing we really want to do is waste our time in regards to that. We want to do things that are good and profitable, things that God is going to listen to, and we need to be praying as such. So anyway, I hope it'll be a good lesson for us tonight as we think about some of these things. So one type of prayer that would be a waste of time would be praying with our back towards God. That idea or principle comes in part from Ezekiel chapter 8, verses 15 and 16. This is Ezekiel being shown a vision about different abominations that were going on in Israel, things that Israel was committing that they really didn't think many people knew about. But in these verses, he said to me, "Have you seen this, O son of man? Turn again, you will see greater abominations than these." So he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house, and there at the door of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men, with their backs towards the temple of the Lord and their faces towards the east, and they were worshiping the sun towards the east. Isn't that a horrifying scene to think about? Isn't that disturbing to think about 25 men being in the inner temple court, and they have their backs turned to God? And that's specifically talked about, their backs to God. It wasn't just that they were in the temple praying towards the sun, but they specifically had their backs towards the Lord and were worshiping the sun in the east. And so I think that's significant in thinking about that overall attitude. In a lot of ways, it's like you're sticking your nose up at God. You're just kind of making a point to do those things at Him, turning their backs towards Him and facing towards the sun that they were worshiping. It is interesting as well to think about that they're at the right place. You know, they're in the temple. That's a good thing, right? That should have been something acceptable, but they're facing the wrong direction. They're in the temple, but they're showing that their hearts are away from God, the opposite direction that they should have been facing as they are worshiping. So it's kind of like a guy spending time with his wife, but at the same time, all he's thinking about is somebody else or something else. You know, okay, well, you're with your wife, you're in the right place, but you're not thinking about the right things. You're not facing the right things, and you're doing things you ought not. Another passage in the book of Jeremiah mentions the same sort of thing. Jeremiah chapter 2 in verse 27. He says, "For they have turned their back to me and not their face, but in the time of their trouble, they will say, 'Arise and save us.'" That is certainly true throughout most of history. Man has kind of treated God this way, have they not? They turn their backs on God, especially when times are good, and they just do their own thing. But when times get bad, what do? They turn back to God. And they want to know, why, God? Why don't you help me? Why don't you listen to my trouble that I'm going through? And then they're surprised whenever their prayer is not answered, or God isn't listening to them, in some ways turning their back turning his back on them. In fact, in that passage in Jeremiah chapter 2 in verse 28, he goes on to say, "But where are your gods, which you have made for yourself? Let them arise, if they can save you in the time of trouble." So God's saying, you're going to turn away from me when times are good, and then you're going to try to come back to me when times are bad. Where are your gods at? Where's these gods that you created, that you formed? How come you're not praying to them in the times of trouble? So it is good for us to think about our attitude towards God. Praying with our back towards God is a waste of time. And we have to make sure that as Christians, we are not praying that way. We need to make sure that as we pray, that our hearts are correct, and that we are not, in fact, praying with our backs towards God. We want to be at the right place, but we also want to be facing the right one to which we are supposed to be worshiping. In the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 15 and verse 8, Jesus said, "This people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me." And so that's the same sort of principle. They draw near with their mouth, but their heart isn't in the right place. It's far from God. So praying with your back towards God is a waste of time, and it's no wonder that the desired result doesn't come about when that is our attitude towards Him. Secondly, another waste of time would be public prayer without private prayer. If our prayers are just public, what does that show? That we're not really praying as we should, that we don't think about prayer in the proper way. We see that in Matthew chapter 6, verses 5 and 6, in talking about some of the hypocrites and the way that they prayed. Jesus said, "When you pray, you shall not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the corners of the streets, that they may be seen by men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But you, when you pray, go into your room. When you've shut your door, pray to your Father who is in the secret place, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly." The disciples wanted to know how to pray, and the Lord taught them that they're not to pray as the hypocrites pray. How did the hypocrites pray? Out on the street corner. They wanted to be seen by men. They were praying in public. That was really their only motivation, is they wanted to be seen by other people. They're not using prayer as a means to communicate with God. They're not using it as a means to bring themselves closer to Him. They're using it as a tool to be seen by men, a tool to be praised by men. That's not at all the intention of prayer. And God is not pleased if our prayers are like that. That's just a waste of time. So many times we see in the religious world things that are just to be seen of by men. People do a lot of things in that regard. And if we are using prayer as a tool as such, then that's really just a bad use of that. Prayers are going to be wasteful if it's not directed in the way that God has specified. When we think about prayer, communicating with God, the sacredness of that, the great blessing that prayer is, and yet we're going to turn it into something to be self-centered. We're going to use it as a means to promote ourselves. That's a big mistake in trying to do it that way. I'm not going to accomplish what I need to with prayer if that is the case. So if our prayers are only public and they're not private as well, then we've missed out on a great deal because we're not viewing prayer correctly. Praying as a substitute for obedience is also something that is pretty popular, I would say. Praying and not trying to follow what God actually says. It can be just an excuse for the things that are going on. Prayer is not an excuse for obedience, and we don't ever need to think about it in those kinds of terms. There's an interesting passage in Joshua chapter 7, whenever whenever they have such success at Jericho and they go on to the city of Ai, things don't work out so well in the city of Ai. And when that happens, Joshua and the elders of Israel are complaining before God. And it seems like they're kind of putting on quite a show here in verse 6 of Joshua chapter 7. Joshua tears his clothes. He falls to the earth on his face before the ark of the Lord until the evening, both he and the elders of Israel, and they put dust on their heads. And Joshua says, "Alas, O Lord God, why did you ever bring this people over the Jordan, only to deliver us into the hand of the Amorite? Why, oh why, God, did you do these things?" So tearing their clothes, throwing dust on their heads, complaining to God, "Why did you bring us over like this?" Well, God doesn't let that go on very well because there's a big problem. And God breaks this up in verse 10 by saying, "Rise up. Why is it you've fallen on your face? Israel has sinned." So the people were defeated at Ai because of the actions of Achan, him taking things that were prohibited under the ban and had brought disgrace to the nation. Sin was in the camp, and all of these bad things are happening because of that. The point I want to make from this passage, though, is that more prayer wasn't the answer, or prayer only wasn't the answer. The answer was to get yourself up and do what's right. It was time to obey the Lord, not forsake the Lord. And they're praying, they're decrying of all the things that were going on. That wasn't going to make it any better. It's only going to make it better when they took care of the sin and whenever they stopped being disobedient. That was at the heart of what was hindering the blessings of God. And so that's important for us to see as well, is that we can't substitute obedience by just more prayer. If we're not trying to follow God, if we're not doing what he says, if we're not trying to accomplish that, don't just pray more. There's a time when you have to get up and do what he says to do, and spend our time in that as well. And so it wasn't going to be good enough just to bemoan why we have come over here to the land of Canaan and why all these bad things are happening. They needed to get up and deal with the problem that was at hand. And so that's pretty serious for you and I to think about in our own lives. Because if we're not careful, we can pray and we can pray and we can pray and we can wonder why our prayers maybe aren't being answered. But we may know we're involved in things that we shouldn't be. We may know that there's sin in our life and that we're doing things we ought not to do. What's the answer to that? It's not more prayer. It's not that God's ignoring you and doesn't want to hear you. It's that our lives aren't right before him. It's that there's sin involved in our life. And if we're not careful, we won't see it for what it is. And we think, well, he'll listen if we just pray more. But in fact, we need to put the sin away and deal with things as we should. The psalmist said in Psalm 66 and verse 18, "If I regard wickedness in my heart, the Lord will not hear." It's going to be a waste of time if we're just praying more and trying to do what he says less. We need to be, of course, doing both of those things. But it's a pretty serious thing to think about how we view prayer. We see this a lot in the world, people that want you to pray for them, want to pray and do all these things in prayer, and yet they're not even concerned many times with even doing what God says to begin with. But we don't need to ignore what God says and think that prayer is just going to bring about the desired result. Selfish praying. When we think about prayer, selfishness shouldn't really come to mind there. That's not what prayer is. Prayer is to be an honoring of God's name. We are revering him and who he is. We are trying to advance his kingdom, advance his will, bring about those things that he desires. We want to make sure that we are doing things and praying in accordance with his will. All of that is not about me. It's not about self. It's about God, and it's about his desire. Our prayer is to be just that, God-centered, not self-centered. And so anything that's short of it being God-centered is pretty well praying selfishly. We need to see prayer as a means of communicating with God not as a means of a Christmas list, not as a means of a complaint system or anything like that. It needs to be centered upon God and focused on Him and His will. And if we use it a different way, it's not really the way God has intended for that to be used. Over in the book of James, in chapter 4, in verse 1, James writes, "What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Is not the source your pleasures that wage war in your members? You lust and do not have, so you commit murder. You are envious and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, so that you may spend it on your pleasures." See the parallel with that there? Asking with wrong motives. You look at the things he mentions there, the lusting and the murder, the envy, and all these selfish desires. And you're not receiving because you're not asking. But when you are asking, you're not receiving because you don't have the right motivations. You're only asking because you have the wrong motivation in what you're doing. You just want to spend it on your pleasures. And so selfish prayers is not what we should be doing. And that is not just a 21st century thing. The quarrels, the conflicts, all that was going on there, the lusting and the not obtaining, it was all about them here in the kind of prayers that they were praying. So very selfish praying that was taking place. That's not, again, what prayer is about. It's supposed to be centered and focused on God and His will. The next one that is kind of related to that as well is the idea of praying to oneself. You probably know where this one is going. Luke chapter 18. In Luke chapter 18, we have the Pharisee and the publican. You have the Pharisee praying, "God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or like this tax gatherer over here." He's praying that way. In fact, it says in verse 11, the Pharisee stood and was praying thus to himself. Hence the name of this point. Praying to oneself. That's really as far as the prayer got, right? It really wasn't directed towards God. It was about himself. And that's exactly what he's doing. It's not a prayer centered on God or centered on God's will or trying to do things in accordance with that. It's basically just a means of promoting himself. Thank you, God, that I'm so great. You are so lucky to have me on your side, and that I'm not like this guy over here. And it's just a tremendous thing to think about, that kind of prayer. Spending time before God, trying to convince Him that you're special, trying to convince Him that you're really something. And that, of course, is not what prayer is about. Prayer is not an avenue for us to brag on ourselves. How are you going to do that when God knows about you more than you do? And are you going to tell Him something that He doesn't know, or something that He doesn't realize? If you're going that route, you might want to find somebody who doesn't know you and then talk to them. But that's not going to be God, because He's going to know you better than anything. And so that's going to be one who's trying to promote himself, trying to brag about himself. How could God possibly take that seriously? Because if everything out of your mouth is just trying to make yourself look good, then you're just praying to yourself, and it's not really about God at all. What a waste of time that is to think about a prayer like this Pharisee prays, as opposed to the publican who knows his faults, knows his sins, is aware of that, is sorrowful about that. What can he say other than, "Forgive me, God, I'm a sinner," and recognize the tremendous need that he has, and that he's not, in fact, worthy at all. Well, we're going to close tonight on more of a positive note. There are certainly some areas like this that are a waste of time, but let's not lose sight of the focus of prayer and what it's really about. James 5 and verse 16 says, "The effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much." That needs to be a focus that we have, not only on the praying, but also on the righteousness part. Strive to do what God says. Strive to be obedient to His will. the effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. I read a somewhat funny story the other day I thought was good maybe to share. It talks about a Christian woman who received a message that her daughter was very sick with a fever. And she left work, went to the pharmacy to get some medication for her daughter. And what do you know? She locks her keys in the car, not her car and the keys, her keys in the car. And she is just beside herself with worry for her daughter. I need to get home and give my daughter this medication. So she prays to God to send help to her. And she's very desperate. And within 5 minutes, there's a guy that pulls in, and he's dirty, he's greasy, has a rag on his head, got a beard that's unkept, and she's thinking, "You sent me this to help?" Well, he gets out, and she tells the guy her story. "My daughter's very sick, and I've stopped to get medication, locked my keys in the car. Could you possibly get the door open of the car?" And he says, "Sure," walks over there, and within a minute has the car door open, and she hugs the man, and she's crying, and she says, "Thank you so much. You're a very nice man." And he says, "Lady, I'm not a nice man at all. I just got out of prison today for car theft, and I've only been out for about an hour." And she hugged him again, and she said, "Thank you, Lord, for sending me a professional." I thought that was pretty funny, but it really makes the point about our prayers to God and what it is we are asking for. God knows more than we do on what we really need. And if we are sincere in talking to God, our Father, and using it as a means for accomplishing His will, then we should have confidence with that. But otherwise, it's just a waste of time if we're not careful. Let's be aware of that and think about our motivations in our praying, our striving to do what's right before the Lord, and our desire to do His will, recognizing that all good things come from Him. But I should be thinking about that and have my heart focused on His goodness and His will and not on anything selfish. Tonight, if we can help in any way, we'd like to do that. If you'll let it be known by coming forward this evening, as together we stand and sing. I need Thee every